a joint appointment with Public Health England, where I sit in the adults and older adults policy team. I'm delighted to say we're joined today by three great speakers: Amy McSweeney, Evidence Officer here at Centre for Ageing Better; Stephen Bevan, Head of HR Research Development at the Institute of Employment Studies; and Angela Matthews, who's Head of Policy and Research at the Business Disability Forum. Just some housekeeping before we start. We're live streaming this session on Ageing Better's YouTube channel, and the webinar will be available to view on demand immediately after we've finished, and we will also share all the slides after the event. All live attendees are in listen-only mode, so if you have questions for the panel, please do post them using the Q&A box, which you'll find in the control ribbon at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're also welcome to please use the chat box for any comments or responses that you have. Just to say, please make sure that you check that in the to box, it's the message will go to all panelists and attendees so that everyone sees your posts. And we'd really like you to use the chat function to introduce yourselves to each other, and so that you can share your own projects, thoughts, work ideas with each other, because that's part of the purpose of these webinars, is to get conversations going, share good practice and learning. And for those of you who are tuning in on YouTube, you're welcome to use the conversation on Twitter using our hashtag #AgeingBetterEvents. And my colleagues will curate any questions that you pose on Twitter and feed them through to me to pose to our panel. So please do use that. So by way of background, today's webinar is the last in a series of webinars we've been running in collaboration with Public Health England to explore the principles of our Healthy Ageing Consensus Statement. And a link is being posted in the chat now to the statement for those of you who aren't familiar with it. The statement sets out the 5 principles or areas for action that, taken together, will promote healthy ageing. And the theme of today's webinar is health and work. Health and work actually spans 3 of our consensus statement's principles. Firstly, it covers the principle which is about prevention and ensuring timely access to support to help manage health conditions. Secondly, it touches on the principle which is removing barriers and creating opportunities for older adults to contribute to society. And thirdly, one of the principles in the statement is challenging ageist attitudes and practices. So 1 in 3 workers in the UK is aged 50 or older, but nearly 1 million people aged 50 to 64 are involuntarily out of work, most commonly for health reasons. And when people in this age group do fall out of work, they struggle the most to return to the labour market. So it's really important that we do more to ensure that people with health conditions or disability are supported to remain in their jobs. It's also important to note that ill health isn't an inevitable part of being middle-aged, but as we get older, we are more likely to experience a long-term condition. 45% of those aged 50 to 64 report at least one long-term condition. So as employers, we must recognise and respond to our employees' changing needs. And our 3 speakers have been invited here today to give us their insights into how we can do this. So first up is Amy McSweeney, a colleague here at Centre for Ageing Better. Amy's going to present the insights from some qualitative research that we published yesterday, looking at how people with long-term health conditions experienced the world of work during the COVID pandemic. And a link to the report that we published yesterday is being posted in the chat now. So over to you, Amy.
Great, thanks, Alison. So as Alison said, I work with the Centre for Ageing Better, and I'm just going to give you a very brief insight into the research that we have commissioned. But I would urge you to read the full report on our website, because there are some really great case studies, and there's the real opportunity for you to learn more about the individual circumstances of people with long-term health conditions within this age cohort. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why is health at work important given that we are aging as a society? So we know that just under half of people who are 50 to 64 already have one long-term health condition. Um, and that poor health can mean that they're pushed out of the labour market earlier than they would like to be, and earlier than is good for employers and society. So we can see this illustrated in labour market statistics already. So we can see that there's a 13% age employment gap between people 50 to 64 and 39 to 44. And there's a disability, and there are just over half of people who are disabled are in employment compared to 81% of people who aren't classed as disabled. So that's nearly 30 percentage points fewer. And the reason why we chose to commission this work is because that we felt that there was real momentum in the health and work agenda prior to the pandemic. The Health is Everyone's Business consultation had opened in 2019, and there were significant conversations in government around what more could be done to support people with long-term health conditions to stay in work. But we were quite aware that the pandemic would shift government priorities. So we wanted to highlight the urgency of this situation for older workers with long-term health conditions. Next slide, please. Great. So we decided to commission this research looking at the experiences of about 20 people approaching later life. So we kind of define that time period as between 50 to 69. And luckily, we're joined by one of the researchers from the Institute for Employment Studies, Stephen Bevan, who will be talking a little bit later. And what we worked with the Institute for Employment Studies, and they worked with a number of small charity partners to recruit the people we spoke to. So they included working with Cancer, Parkinson's UK, and Obesity UK. So we wanted to look at people's experiences over some time. So they spoke to participants, first of all, in August and September of last year, and then again in February of this year. And in between that time period, participants were asked to fill in monthly prompted journals. So the majority of those questions, while they did change over time a little bit, were around how people's health conditions had impacted their work before COVID, how it was at that time point in the pandemic, and how they expected this to change in the future. Next slide, please. Great, so I'm going to talk, so as I said, this is just a little bit of an insight into what's actually in the report, but I'm going to do that through under sort of two subheadings. So I'm going to talk firstly about evergreen truths about health and work. So those are things that if we'd have done this research before the pandemic, would probably still have come up. And then again, I'm going to talk a little bit about what has changed and what is specific to COVID in terms of what helps older workers with long-term health conditions. Next slide, please. Great. So one of the themes that came out most strongly was around good line management. So the people we spoke to felt that most of the people we spoke to felt they had some support from their line manager, although that did take different guises. And for the majority of them, they felt that this support was integral to their well-being at work, and it mattered just as much as reasonable adjustments or the provision of specialist equipment. So Laura's statement here really demonstrates the kind of things that people told us about their managers. So Laura said, "My manager really understands. When I had time off last year for depression, she would check in on me to see if I was okay. There was never any pressure. When I am in work and need to move around a bit to help with the back pain, she just says, do what is best for you." So Laura really valued the fact that her line manager wasn't just concentrating on her ability to work, but also on her general well-being. So that was the case for the majority of people we spoke to. But Caroline, for example, who we also spoke to, worked for a large bank. And although they had policies in place, they didn't seem to be instituted. And the fact that she had a poor relationship with her line manager really impacted her well-being at work. So Caroline said, I felt really let down by my manager. She did not understand the practices and policies the organisation has about sickness absence, and she offered no help or support about adjustments. She is young and does the how are you, but doesn't listen or even try to understand the experiences I face every day. So for Caroline, that lack of support was really important, and it meant that she felt unsupported in her broader organisation. Next slide, please. Okay, so we also another theme that came out quite strongly was around part-time work, and part-time work is part of the solution for older workers with long-term health conditions. So a good number of the people that we spoke to were in part-time work, and that could have taken the form of a traditional part-time work contract where they worked several days a week on set hours, or it could be a 0 hours contract. And some of them had specifically chosen that in order to manage their energy levels, particularly where they had a condition where they could expect the symptoms to fluctuate. So Penny says, when you get that fatigued, it takes a long time to get back, which is why I have the jobs that I can come in and out of. More part-time work, that's always been my sort of saviour, because not being well, a full-time job, sometimes you're not well enough to do that, whereas a part-time job, you can be reliable. So while for Penny, part-time work is a saviour, we know that there are financial consequences to part-time work, and we know that there are other significant effects, such as difficulty accessing statutory sick pay. But also it's important to note that although some of the people we spoke to had deliberately chosen part-time work, it may not be a real choice at all for some, because perhaps they are able to work full-time hours, but that they need a level of flexibility that they weren't able to get from a full-time job as they are available now. Next slide, please. So turning now to what changed during the pandemic. I think it's important to say that one of the biggest things that came out of this research was a level of continuity. So the employers who generally provided good support to their employees before the pandemic commonly continued to do so. That support may have changed, but it was generally the case that employers who were not supportive did not improve, and that employers who were supportive continued to support. So I think as well, it's important to note that that didn't just take the guise of, for supportive employers, that didn't necessarily take the guise of a really good policy. So for example, Caroline, whose quote I used earlier, one of our participants, although she worked for a large bank who had policies in place to ensure that that were intended to ensure that she got the support she needed, at one point she was referred to occupational health, but the recommendations were never instituted. And sort of on the opposite side, another one of our participants, Henry, he worked for an SME who didn't have formal occupational support, but his employers gave him the level of flexibility he needed to feel supported in work. Next slide, please. And also moving to remote work. So this is something that obviously is not necessarily specific to people with long-term conditions, but it is something that was very important to a lot of the people we spoke to. So the majority of people felt that remote working was a positive change, in that most of them were able to manage their energy levels by instituting a level of flexibility in their work that they weren't able to do while working in an office or in a physical workplace. So this was positive for a lot of people, but I'm just going to read a quote from Susan now that kind of demonstrates a lot of the feedback that people had. Was they said that it's a real double-edged sword. It's fantastic, I can work from home. However, because of it in this new role, I haven't felt that I've been able to become part of the team. So as sort of Susan says, and a lot of the other participants said, they felt that remote working was good for their physical health, but could have a detrimental impact on their mental health. This was particularly the case given that several of the people we spoke to had long-term mental health conditions, and some felt that isolation or not being able to meet new colleagues had a real impact on their mental health. So some of the employers who had been able to mitigate this instituted things like virtual informal socializing, as well as check-ins on a regular basis. So there were things that that employers could do to ensure that remote working wasn't as detrimental to people's mental health, but there's definitely more to be done on that front. Next slide, please. So even though, initially the 20 people we spoke to were people who were in employment at the beginning of the pandemic. So we wanted to do that so that we could learn about how their employment situation changed over about 6 months or so. But even the people who were in relatively stable employment throughout the course of the time we spoke to them were quite worried about the prospect of becoming unemployed. So the people we spoke to with long-term conditions were worried about a mix of both ageism and ableism in a more competitive job market. So Julia, one of our participants, although she was furloughed, she obviously was in work at the time, but she was worried about the prospect of becoming unemployed and having to compete. So she told us, "I think it's very hard to get a job at the minute, especially as I'm not a young kid that's fit and can do just anything. It limits me for what I can apply for. And I just think there's going to be a lot of people better qualified than me." And that's something that came out for people from a variety of different employment experiences. They felt that employers that they would be directly competing against younger people who may have become unemployed during the pandemic. And they didn't feel that employers would recognize their unique skills. So that's something that Susan again brought up. So Susan said, "Even though I've got all these different skills, suddenly I find myself at the age of 52, 53, looking for employment again. And I was quite shocked. I just felt everyone was a bit ageist. Trying to get a job, and when you haven't got very current skills, they couldn't see past that." So a number of the people we spoke to felt that although they had these skills and experience, they weren't necessarily in a format that employers were interested in, that employers often weren't able to look past their age to recognize their skills. And that kind of chimes with Aging Better's recent GROW project, the Good Recruitment for Older Workers project, where we looked at the experiences of older workers in recruitment. And a lot of them felt that although they had the skills, employers were looking for those skills to be presented in a format that a younger person was more likely to have, so for example, specific qualifications that are newer. And that was a real worry for a lot of people. Next slide, please. So that was just a brief whistle-stop tour of some of the themes that emerged from the research. And I'm not going to read out all of these other additional themes that I didn't quite mention, but I just wanted to give you a flavour of some of the things that had come out around sort of people's valuing work and people being quite aware of stigma, just before I move on to our recommendations for government and employers. So you can kind of see where the themes that led us to form these recommendations. So I'll move on to them now. Next slide, please. I can't see the next slide with recommendations, but I will bring you through them anyway. Okay, so yeah, I think I might have just missed it. There we go. Great. So yeah, so some of the recommendations that we have suggested in response to the experiences that people told us, they were kind of fell under two categories. So we've gone with government and employers. So firstly, we would call upon government to publish their response to the Health is Everyone's Business consultation. So this was obviously a consultation designed to understand more about people's health at work. It closed in July 2019, but the government has not yet outlined published their response, sorry. We would also ask that the government bring forth to Parliament some of the key parts of the employment bill. So the ones that would be most important for workers, older workers with long-term health conditions, would be ensuring the right to flexible work from day one and the establishment of a single enforcement body for employment rights. And although this didn't really come out in the research, in this specific research, we know that the rate of statutory sick pay in the UK is much lower than that of European averages. So if we look within the OECD, we can see that statutory sick pay is approximately less than 10% of previous earnings in the UK, compared to over 60% in the rest of the OECD. And while the majority of people have access to some form of occupational sick pay, about a quarter don't. And for them, it's a pretty woeful representation of their previous earnings. So in the OECD, only 2 other countries have lower replacement rates, the US and South Korea, neither of which have any statutory sick pay at all. So turning now to employers, we would ask that they actively try to learn from the mass experiment of home working, to recognise that they can do this on an ongoing basis for all workers, particularly those with long-term conditions, but also making sure that they're aware of things they can do to mitigate some of the drawbacks of remote working, if they are there for some people. We would also ask employers to explicitly commit to being anti-ageist and anti-ableist. So this would be in recruitment as well as in their everyday employment practices. And I think it's vital as well that employers invest in line management training. So as we saw from Caroline's story earlier, although the policies were in place to ensure that Caroline was supported in work, her line manager wasn't instituting those policies, whether that be through lack of training or lack of understanding. Employers need to make sure that line managers are sufficiently trained and supported to provide the support for people with long-term health conditions. Next slide, please. Great, thank you very much. So I'm just going to pass back to Alison now so she can introduce, I think, Stephen to talk a little bit about, to hear a little bit from the researchers themselves.
Thanks, Amy. That's brilliant to hear those insights. And I think that point about, the having workplace policies means nothing if people don't actually implement them, and if line managers in particular aren't trained to handle these situations. We've had loads of really great discussion in the chat, so please do keep that going. Please keep sharing your thoughts, but also where you're from and the kind of work that you're involved in. And just to remind you, I know it's a pain, but to just try and make sure that you're sending the chat messages to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, you're only talking to me and the other speakers, which you might want to do. So we'll hold questions for now and move straight to our next speaker. Stephen Bevan is Head of HR Research Development at the Institute of Employment Studies. And as Amy said, it was Stephen's institute that did that work for us. Stephen's going to give his personal perspective and also share insights from other research that the Institute has done on this topic and what it means for employers and government. So over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Alison. Morning, everyone. It's really nice to be invited to present this morning. I'm really pleased to have been working with Centre for Ageing Better again. I'd certainly like to thank Amy and all her colleagues for their help and the support as we've been doing the work. I'd also like to give a shout out to my colleagues, Megan Edwards, Beth Mason and Zafia Burek, who actually did most of the work, actually. Really enjoyed this piece of work. It was really interesting to follow people. And also just quickly like to thank the charities who helped us to connect with our participants. So the Institute for Employment Studies is a research charity, been going since the late 60s. We've been doing a lot of work on both health and work and ageing at work for many years now. We were involved in the early 90s in the Carnegie Review into the Third Age. And we've done several pieces of work for the Centre for Ageing Better, looking at job quality, midlife reviews, recruitment bias, and so on. Next slide, please. So the interesting thing about this piece of work is that it's pretty much the first time in my over 35 years of doing research that I've been such a close match personally to the participant profile for the study. Because I myself am an older worker living with a long-term health condition. So I just want to share a few personal reflections, which sort of echo some of the points brought out in the research, and then I'll broaden it out into what I think needs to be done. So I had a diagnosis of esophageal cancer in 2018. The thing to remember about people living with cancer in the UK is that 50% of those receiving a cancer diagnosis are of working age. But despite big improvements in cancer survival rates, fewer than 2/3 are still in work 1 year after a diagnosis. So we're actually not that good at getting people back to work after even successful cancer treatment. Like many others with my particular cancer, I underwent chemotherapy, an esophagectomy, which is a fairly major operation, followed up by some more chemo and then some radiotherapy. And I finished my treatment 6 months before COVID. And it is worth remembering that a lot of people have presented late during the pandemic with cancer symptoms, and we're perhaps yet to see the full implications of a delayed cancer diagnosis because of the lockdown. One of the consequences for me, and 20% of people who have chemo also have this problem, is that you have an elevated risk of developing thrombosis. And I had a pulmonary embolism, which meant that I was on the shielding group. And also working from home in some ways for me during lockdown was a positive thing. It's not great to have a pulmonary embolism during the time of a respiratory virus. And I was relatively new to part-time working. And like many people, I found navigating the boundary between work and non-work time quite challenging, still finding that challenging, as many of my colleagues will testify. However, as you'd expect, or at least hope, the Institute for Employment Studies, having done so much work on this, was really good at supporting me, which is brilliant. And the key thing was that it allowed me to take the lead in crafting both a pathway back to work and a role in a work pattern that helped support my recovery. But one of the problems that people living with cancer and many other long-term conditions that aren't obviously visible to people is that you look fine on the outside, but many people experience fatigue, mental health problems, or challenges about making the adjustment to working after their treatment. For many people living with cancer, they have what we colloquially call scanxiety. If you're monitoring after your treatment, it requires you to have frequent scans, and that can be one of the real problems that people face. And sadly, with my cancer, I don't even get that opportunity because it's not detectable through scans. So if it comes back, that's it. And one of the challenges for people like me is that we're often haunted by the fear that the cancer will return well before you're ready for it. And that's actually quite hard for colleagues to appreciate, and probably even harder if you're an employer to know how to support someone with those feelings, because it's actually almost impossible to know what to do other than to be empathetic. And of course, for many people like me, it's meant reassessing the meaning and role of work in your life. It means that perhaps if you're part of your recovery may mean getting back on the hamster wheel of the work you were doing before you started, or preferably finding an alternative way of adding value in your job and also getting fulfillment from your job. So this is a constant challenge. Next slide, please. Now, as we know, there's been lots of previous research on these issues. And I hope the research that we at IES have been doing together with Aging Better will contribute considerably to that. Just a few reflections, really. It's pretty clear that despite all the slightly breathy journalistic commentary about the differences between generations, we have all these epithets to describe different generational cohorts. It's pretty clear that older workers want much the same out of their work as younger colleagues. But as we know, they can be the victims of what often is called the soft bigotry of low expectations. Most of the dimensions of good work are things that older workers want as much role and autonomy in their jobs. They want opportunities for growth and learning and development. And we perhaps need to challenge some of these assumptions about people being less ambitious or being scared of technology. They're easy stereotypes to trigger, but life is a lot more complicated than that. And many older workers are really still very driven to continue to do good work and to contribute. We know from the research that multi-generational workforces can really enhance knowledge exchange and productivity. And this is one of the features of a piece of work we did recently with the OECD, looking at multi-generational workforces. And was also a subject of another webinar we did collaboratively with Aging Better as well. We know during lockdown there's been a real social deficit for many people who've been working from home, particularly younger workers. And one of the things that's very interesting is that working from home has impaired opportunities in some organisations for knowledge exchange, and for younger workers get coaching support and mentoring and so on. And that's one of the things that hopefully once the lockdown is eased and people go back to a more balanced way of working, that older workers will be able to make a contribution to the support of the development of their younger colleagues. I think it's really important that we don't define people by their condition. I'm not a cancer patient. I'm a mostly competent professional with lots, I hope, still to contribute. So focusing on what people can't do rather than what they can is a really important thing. Sorry, can do rather than what they can't is a really important aspect of this. If we're going to have an inclusive way of helping people living with a long-term condition to feel part of the organisation. And at the moment, I think we still over-medicalise some of these issues, and we also focus too much on what someone's health condition stops them doing. We also know that good work has therapeutic benefits. It provides people with social connectivity, a sense of purpose, increases their agency, their self-efficacy, their self-esteem and their confidence. And of course, there's a big debate in the UK about job quality, particularly as the labour market recovers. We need to make sure those people living with long-term conditions aren't left behind. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Last slide, in fact. So just to add to the list that Amy put up earlier, which we of course fully support, we think there's some additional messages for employers and for government. I'm quite often asked, what can employers do about this? Because obviously, hybrid working is something that we're all thinking about and exploring. How do you do job design in a creative way to support people living with a health condition? And it is pretty clear to me that self-management is a really important part of this. Most people are the best judges of what type of work was good for them. And also, I'm very interested in how this concept of job crafting, which is, I think, becoming more and more popular, which enables individuals to have much more of a say in how their job is determined, is actually embedded in the way we manage people who are managing the transition from perhaps treatment into living with a long-term condition. We know from the evidence that peer support can be really good. There are lots of organisations who have really interesting employee networks of people living with, for example, Parkinson's disease, or supporting relatives with dementia and so on. Organisations who can give access to peer support. People, I have myself, provided peer support for other people I know who are living and working with cancer based on my own experience, and that can be an incredibly positive and inclusive way of supporting people. We also need to remove barriers to disclosure. That's something that came up in some of our case studies. A real concern that if you disclose you have a long-term health condition, you may be seen as a weak link or a burden to your colleagues, or that once you start talking about having a long-term condition, if you have any career ambitions, that you may be suffering from a long-term career deficit or career death, as someone called it, if you disclose you have a health problem. Some organisations use a workplace adjustment passports. So if you manage to negotiate and adapt your job to help you cope with your health condition, then have that codified, have that written down, so that if you move jobs or you get a new manager, you don't have to go through that whole process again. So you can increase your mobility around the organisation, and people can get used to the type of support that helps you continue to work. I'd also quite like us to lose this concept of reasonable adjustments. Let's just call them adjustments. Calling them reasonable implies that the organisation is patting you on the head and giving you a concession, and I think we need to change the language around this. lot of emphasis in our research on the importance of having a good line manager. Several people have said to us the best workplace adjustment you can get is a great line manager. And I think our research confirms that. It's really important that organisations don't regard kindness by line managers as a sign of weakness. I think that's one of the big lessons from lockdown. Those managers have been able to do that well, have actually helped people cope, and employees' mental health have been better. I think one of the most shocking quotations I've heard during this lockdown is from a senior manager in a large organisation I won't mention, who said, job stress is a better driver of productivity than a well-being policy. Now, I don't think that's representative of all line managers, but it still represents a significant minority of the attitudes of line managers in the UK, and we need to challenge that. And I hope that this research will make a contribution. Finally, on government, I think certainly to echo what Amy was saying about the right to flexibility from day one. IS has been doing some work recently with TimeWise, and we've shown from our data the shocking figure that part-time working in the UK has fallen dramatically to its lowest ever level, particularly for women. And so one of the things we need to do is to make sure that we try and rebalance that. And I think it's really, really important. Secondly, we think that the Access to Work scheme, which is a really good scheme, although not many people know about it, to help people make adjustments, could be adapted for people who are working in a hybrid way, and particularly focus much more on mental health than it does currently. We think that the provisions of the Equalities Act and also the Health and Safety at Work Act need to be properly enforced. There's been a sort of vague announcement from the government about a single enforcement body, but still not enough detail. And we think that some of the conditions which are protected characteristics under the Equalities Act, employers don't really understand their obligations. And also we think that more employers should be required to comply with the already strong provisions of the Health and Safety at Work Act 74 to do risk assessments of psychosocial risk at work, which I think is really important. And then finally, this is more a health policy issue. We need healthcare professionals to regard work as a clinical outcome of their care. It's not currently a requirement for healthcare professionals to collect data on people's employment status, for example. And that we need to make sure that return to work is embedded in things like care pathways, clinical guidance. And it'd be a good start if people in primary and secondary care ask questions of their patients about the importance of work to them and whether or not a return to work is an important part of their recovery. So this has been a really fascinating journey, this project, fascinating insight, some brilliant participants. We think that there's real momentum now behind this idea of making sure that people living with long-term conditions have the right to feel included and the right to good quality jobs. And we hope that our research has given some of those people a voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was amazing. Really, really powerful stuff. And there's lots of comments and things in the chat, so please do read them. People are really thankful for you being so open and honest about your own situation, but also then linking that to the really important recommendations that you make. And that question about what's important for you, around work, but also around health recovery, I think is really, really important. So our final, last but not least, speaker today is Angela Matthews. Angela is Head of Policy and Research at the Business Disability Forum. Sorry, Angela, I will get it right one of these days. And she's going to give her reflections on what we've heard today and what needs to change to support people with health conditions or a disability to remain in work. So over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Alison, and please don't worry about that. As someone with a stammer, I can't say the title of the organisation I work for well anyway, so I call it BDF. Thank you ever so much to Centre for Ageing Better for inviting me to speak on this webinar. There are a few organisations who I always love to follow at conferences and in webinars, because what they say sets me up perfectly for what I want to say, and the IES is one of those. So thank you also for putting Stephen before me. Given time, I've scribbled out a few things I was going to say that have already been mentioned, so that I don't repeat what what you've already heard. So just to say that this BDF is a membership organisation. We work with around 400 employers. So if I refer to members, I'm talking about the some 400 employers that we speak to. We spend our working lives speaking to every day here at BDF. Now, I come to the health and work agenda from a number of places. First of all, having started a career working with people who had become disabled in occupational therapy setting, also then moving into HR, and also getting older with a long-term condition myself. I have a genetic liver condition, and as I've aged with that condition, my job, a good job, and having a job that enables me to be independent and that I love getting up to do every single day is everything to me. So echoing Stephen's, not just work as a good health outcome, but good work is everything to me. And I guess that's why I do the job I do. So beyond that, the landscape, very briefly, in which I'm speaking to you today, is partly we're about to start a big project on work and health, having just done some research on statutory sick pay and also working carers, particularly older working carers as well. So of course, the experience of carers is different. The experience of older carers is very different. But we spoke to a lot of carers who typically were above the age of 45. They have children themselves who they are supporting. And when I say children, I mean maybe people in their late teenage years or in their 20s who are going through life changes themselves, such as leaving university, going to university, buying their new home or their first home. So employees spoke of supporting their children in that way, whether it was financially or through just big life stuff. So above the age of 45, 50, into their 60s, supporting their children, caring for someone else, working themselves, managing a long-term condition themselves, and working for an organisation who was either currently restructuring or intended to in the upcoming year, given a pandemic. So that was the typical context in which carers were speaking to us. Really interesting that those carers said that they felt that they hadn't been listened to on many levels. So by government, by employer, i.e. the organisation's wider inclusion strategy, but also, as Centre for Ageing Better's report showed, by their line manager. Now, also, during COVID, just to echo Stephen's words on the health setting, because we can't make recommendations, we can't have this conversation without the health setting and thinking about the policy in the health setting right now. So because of COVID, a lot of people, particularly older workers in our organisation, who have become disabled or they have acquired a health condition during the last 2 years or so. Because of COVID, a lot of procedures, a lot of treatments, a lot of regular appointments and diagnostic appointments have been cancelled. What this meant for a lot of older workers in BDF member organisations was that even after the first lockdown, when a lot of our members said, hey, workforce, we're going to go back to the workplace, we're going to return to our jobs now, we're going to come off of furlough, a lot of older workers who had acquired a condition during the pandemic were now disabled and could not return. For those who already had a condition when the pandemic came, but had their treatment, their ongoing appointments, or their regular therapies or medical interventions postponed, then they too have experienced some worsening of their condition, which again has meant that many have come off of furlough and into a phased return or into long-term sickness absence. Something else that we can't blame the pandemic for because it was already happening. On the statutory sick pay issue, a lot of the time SSP is running out before a lot of people can even get their appointment or see a specialist in the NHS. So that's not SSP runs out before they get a diagnosis, that's SSP is running out before they can get an appointment to put them on the journey of achieving a diagnosis. So when we're talking about the health and work agenda and an age inclusive one, I've got some other things in my mind. So a couple of years ago, BDF did a piece of research on the different expectations of older workers and young workers. The type of employer or job structures, working patterns that they look for. And one really interesting thing was that younger people tended to have a more sort of understanding of, they looked for employers from an ethical perspective. So does this employer have green policies? What's their perspective on animal testing? How do they look after the environment? Younger workers also were more likely to have an I am narrative. So I am a carer. I am someone with autism, for example. And we didn't see that when we looked at older workers as much. Instead, what older workers were looking for, now it's not that they're not interested in green policies and the environment, but their priority was looking at job structures and working patterns that worked for them. And in the context of working for them, what that meant was a job they're going to be able to do while they manage everything else in their lives. Caring, long-term condition, a child coming back from university and has to move into the home again. So really interesting that when I spoke to older workers who were also carers, what was quite common was words such as, I have never spoken about this before, or thank you for listening, or I've never been asked this before. Now, really interesting because I'm a researcher in a non-profit organisation and they hadn't had these conversations with their line managers and neither had they been asked about them either. So age, like disability, is often an afterthought in workplace inclusion policies. Discrimination claims in employment tribunals are rising. I think actually it might even have been Patrick Thompson from Centre for Ageing Better, whose comment I read in the press, where he was saying ETs are a last course of action. You know, this, and for a lot of people, especially older workers, supporting children, having a long-term condition themselves and being a carer for someone, leaving your job to pursue an employment tribunal is almost impossible, a lot of people told us. So one of the things that I've been picking up on recently in our carers research, in our research about what sort of work different groups, disabled people, young disabled people and older people are looking for, I'm hearing a word or a theme coming up more and more. Really interesting that it also came up when I read Centre for Ageing Better's report yesterday, and Amy mentioned it this morning. And it's this thing about listening. So for those of you who listen to the Today programme on Radio 4, you might have even heard Peter Cheese, Chief Exec of CIPD, mentioned the other day. We need to look at how line managers are listening. Amy mentioned earlier someone from her research. My line manager asked the question, but she didn't listen to the answer and nothing was done. And I think if employers have got good policies, we think, great, this is good. But actually, what these various pieces of research are showing, and people's stories are telling us, is that there is a huge chasm between policy and practice. And actually, in the context of an impending national disability strategy, where businesses haven't been consulted with, and a lot of disabled people have not been able to give feedback, listening in policy design is more important now more than ever. Alison, I can see you've come on screen. Do I have a 2-minute warning or something?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, because we've got a great question that I'd like to pose to Stephen, and then another one for you. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind, thanks, Angela.
Okay, I'm going to try and do the rest in 2 minutes. So first of all, I wanted to refer to the employment bill really quickly. Now, a lot of disappointment when this wasn't raised in the Queen's speech. I have to say I made my peace with that. There was a lot in the employment bill that is not fit for purpose. There's a lot, a week's leave for unpaid carers, quite frankly, comes nowhere near enough supporting older workers who have caring responsibilities. Anyone who's interested, I can send you our research on that. But frankly, that needs to be revised, and there needs to be a proper equality analysis done by BEIS to revise that proposal. Equally, a lot of older workers, a lot of disabled people, and a lot of carers, working carers, saying flexible working is not flexible. We get the opportunity to ask once a year and then it can't change. It's not a day one right. And also, it's, you know, once we've asked once, it's actually quite structured and quite permanent. It doesn't allow for the person I care for to become unwell. It doesn't even allow for my condition to fluctuate. So what the range of what flexible means, actually, we need to look at that as well. So one final point I just wanted to make, just on partly following what Amy said about the research. So employers who have listened to carers, older workers, and people with long-term conditions in their organisations generally found it easier to move to working from home on the first lockdown. So, and also, what we saw in terms of listening in organisations, 83% of our member organisations said their CEO and their COO was involved in moving their workforce to home working during the first lockdown, which in terms of hearing on the ground what employees' life is like, and the experience of carers and disabled workers on the ground was unprecedented. I've got a lot more I could say. I've got some stuff on what the types of practices employers are doing, and some policy points. Maybe I'll pause it so that Alison can get through what she wants to.
Thanks, Angela.
Thank you for listening.
There have been various questions in the chat. So Angela, if you want to post anything like links to your research or any other points in the chat, please do. We have had a question in from Chico for Amy and or Stephen in terms of any evidence for recommendations specific to place, so sort of how to make those adjustments or any elements of practices to promote health. So I don't know if it's possible to answer that in a nutshell, given that we're so short on time. Stephen, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, in fact, we've been doing quite a lot of research on people during lockdown, of course, since March 2020. And what we found in the first 10 to 12 weeks of lockdown was that there was a quite high spike in the number of people reporting musculoskeletal symptoms, certainly neck, shoulder, back pain problems. I suppose, you know, with a very rapid shift to people working, you know, hunched over a laptop on the kitchen table, that's perhaps not unexpected. But what we did find is that those employers who were actually doing risk assessments and providing ergonomic support, display screen equipment and so on, their employees actually suffer those symptoms less. But there's quite a high percentage of those people who had also comorbid depression and anxiety. So it's pretty clear that efforts by employers to support people's physical well-being in terms of exercise, the ergonomic setup of their home office and so on really does pay dividends. I think the HSE was a little bit slow to be offering advice so soon after the lockdown. They got their act together eventually, but I think if we're going to have hybrid working and people working on a more sustained basis working from home, then I think we need a bit more support for employers to make sure that people aren't causing themselves physical strain, but also have the opportunity to think about how being in a sedentary position at home is probably not good for their health, and trying to improve greater physical activity.
Great, thank you. Chico sent a question in advance, actually, which I thought was interesting, about how do we better understand the work experiences of older underrepresented groups, such as older migrant workers in shift or sort of gig work. Is there more evidence or research that's needed? Does anybody have any insights? Again, that might be Stephen, but
yeah, I'd say there's lots of evidence gaps there. I think it's also a good reminder that lockdown wasn't just about people working from home. Lots of people were key workers and older workers in situations where they perhaps had an elevated exposure to infection, as well as other the normal stresses and strains of work. I don't think we know enough about those underrepresented groups and marginalised groups. So I think definitely more evidence will be useful there, particularly given that we know that things like shift working and so on has an intrinsic link to some aspects of poor health, obesity and so on.
Yeah, thank you. Amy, Lydia has posted a question about self-employment options to support flexible working. Some of the participants, or at least one in our research, was self-employed, weren't they, I think? And
yes.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so about one or two of our participants were self-employed for specific jobs, but they also perhaps worked 0 hours contracts as well. And one of our participants, Penny, who I think I quoted during my presentation earlier, she was one of those who kind of fell through the gaps in terms of government support, in that although she was self-employed, over half of her income was from PAYE sources in the last year. So she was one of those who was not able to get any financial support. But yes, some of the people we spoke to definitely felt that self-employment would be, were they not able to have the flexibility they need, that would essentially be their next best option. But a lot of the people were quite kind of tied that in discussions around security, job security, and yeah, I think that was one of the main factors for them, was around security.
Great, thank you. I realise that we're running dangerously low on time, but let me just see. I mean, I think one of the questions which sort of distills some of the comments and things we've had in is about line manager training. So where do people go for appropriate line manager training in some of these softer skills that are really what makes or breaks people's experience of work? Stephen or Angela, I don't know.
Well, I think the skills you need to manage people in this situation are pretty much the skills you need to manage anyone. There's empathy and listening and being clear and being supportive and so on. All the systematic reviews we've ever done of workplace health interventions show that line managers are really central to this. And you could argue it's partly about training, but it's also about how you appoint them. If you're appointing someone in a line management job because they're a great accountant or a great marketing person, but they're not that interested in managing people, it's sort of something you have to do in order to climb the greasy pole, then they're probably in the wrong job. So I think that we need to think about how we define the role of line managers, obviously training and supporting them and so on, but actually we send the wrong message if we recruit people just because they're great technicians or professionals.
Great, thank you. I think we need to draw it to a close there, but thank you so much for a really lively and interesting discussion. And I think, we've seen in the chat, people have found those presentations really, really powerful. So thank you very much, Amy, Stephen and Angela, for contributing today. A link has been posted to our feedback form, so put it in the chat box. So please do fill that in if you have a chance. And we've also posted details of the next webinar, which is Digital Skills to Connect, which is on the 8th of July. So please do join us then. And otherwise, that just leaves me to say thank you again and goodbye.